go. Looking real good in my passport photo.
Amateur Traveler, episode 573. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about hiking and muskoxen and glaciers, flight seeing and First Nations as we go to the Yukon territories in Canada. Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. A funny thing happened to me in July, right around the beginning of the month. I got an email that said, how would you like to come to the Yukon next week? It's an interesting thing sometimes being a travel blogger and podcaster, but it can lead to some interesting opportunities, and I want to tell you about it in this episode. But without further ado, let's talk about the Yukon. I'd like to welcome the show Stephen Reynolds from Tourism Yukon, who's come to talk to us, strangely enough, about the Yukon. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's a pleasure to be with you.
And I am violating my own unwritten rule here about not having people from the tourism board come on, and we do that just because I'm always looking for an authentic voice, but I feel that Stephen has one. And besides, I'm going to talk about some of the places we ate, and you picked all of those, so that should be of use to that. So I was just in the Yukon, and I was there with Stephen and some of his colleagues on a last-minute trip for me, a trip planned much more in advance for you guys. I want to talk about what we did there, but also what people should do the Yukon. But why don't we start with why should someone come to the Yukon, and start with in the summer, because that's where we were there, and it's a very different place in the summer than in the winter.
Absolutely. It's like two other worlds, just a few months apart. So in terms of your guests and potential guests giving some consideration to a summer visit, the north in general is fascinating in the summertime, mainly because of the midnight sun. A lot of people who live down in the lower 48 and southern Canada and other places that we call south, you still have darkness and night and skies with stars and moons and things like that all through July and August and June. We don't. So starting around the end of May, our sky goes light during the night, and it stays bright, if you will, throughout the entire night until early in August. So most of our visitors from the south find that that phenomenon alone is worth the energy and effort it takes to come up here in the summer, because it's something that most humans don't get to experience. So the midnight sun is predominant. It's there every day. I can guarantee you're going to see midnight sun whenever you come up to the Yukon in June, July, or August. And from an activity perspective, the Yukon is just a little bit larger than the state of California, with only 38,000 people living here. So space is an amazing quality that we have lots of, and vistas that are unimpeded are something else that the Yukon is quite famous for.
You say 38,000 people, but it's not like it's completely unpopulated. There's also 5 times as many caribou as people and twice as many moose.
That's true. The caribou and the moose greatly outnumber the human beings, but the humans tend to stay in the cities, and certainly when you fly into Whitehorse, you'll see more humans than moose or caribou.
Well, and we talk about Whitehorse, and Whitehorse is where we spent a lot of time, in the capital of the Yukon, almost back to its peak population of the gold rush days in the Klondike Gold Rush in the late 1800s. Not quite back to that number yet in terms of Whitehorse, but most of the population of the whole province, well, of the whole territory, is in Whitehorse, and Whitehorse is only barely in the Yukon.
Well, we are in the banana belt down in the south part of the Yukon. We're just under 61 degrees parallel. And yes, you're correct that Whitehorse is the capital city of the Yukon and the center of many levels of government and other industries. So we have about 28,000 of the 38,000 living here in Whitehorse. Once you get outside of Whitehorse, the next largest town is Dawson City, which is 6 hours drive north of Whitehorse, and its population fluctuates in around the 2,000 people mark. So there's a substantial difference once you step out of Whitehorse, and a good friend of mine likes to say that Whitehorse is wonderful because it's only 15 minutes from the real Yukon.
And you say in the banana belt?
Yes.
There are no banana trees in the Yukon.
No, there are no banana trees, and fruit trees are really shrubs like blueberries and raspberries and strawberries. But Whitehorse tends to be much warmer than Dawson City in the wintertime. And so we affectionately call ourselves the banana belt down here, whereas the people in Dawson City will certainly see minus 40 or minus 45 almost every winter guaranteed. In the summertime, it's reversed. Dawson City is typically warmer than Whitehorse. And that's all to do with latitude and midnight sun and the way things happen up here in terms of weather.
And you say it's warmer then, but we were there over the 4th of July weekend, or I was there over the 4th of July weekend, and it was predominantly shirt-sleeve weather. Dawson may be warmer, but the Yukon in this time of year with so much sunlight is a fairly comfortable place. Some rain, some clouds, but predominantly shirt-sleeve weather in terms of temperature. And I did see it start to try and get dark at midnight. I think I may even have a photo someplace of what looks like a sunset at about midnight. And I had to wake up in the middle of the night to basically see anything that looked like dusk, because I would go to sleep at night and it would still be light out or mostly light out. And you'd go walk home for some event that we did. And I found myself always walking to the hotel because it's still light out.
No, it's very true. We have daylight and dusk, and that's about it. I mean, officially we have no night for about almost 60 days of the calendar year. Quite a fascinating thing.
Let's talk about some of the highlights first. In terms of things to do, one of the things that I got to do you haven't quite got to do yet, and it was because you were a really nice guy, and that is we went flight seeing at one of the nearby national parks, the Kluane National Park?
Yeah, that's right. Kluane National Park and Reserve, you're right.
Which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
It is part of the world's largest UNESCO World Heritage Site, combining British Columbia, the Yukon, and the state of Alaska.
Not the entire state or the entire British Columbia.
Well, no.
Right.
The park stretches into all three jurisdictions.
And we had a chance to do a flight seeing tour. Now, I think you've done the flight seeing.
That's correct.
We got to land on a glacier, on the Hubbard Glacier. So first of all, we're talking about the largest non-polar ice fields in the world, or possibly Chile is going to make some argument about that, but at least one of the top two, and I believe we were told the largest non-polar ice field. So just ice everywhere, snow everywhere, spectacular scenery as you fly in this small plane up the valley where the glacier has carved and fly relatively low over the glacier and see the different moraines in the glacier and the crevasses and the incredibly blue pools of water. A tidy bowl blue water here in these little pools in the glacier just was fascinating, as well as gigantic mountains in the background with snow and clouds going over them. And the weather was very cooperative for our trip, and have these spectacular photos of this amazing flight. And then we got to land, which you haven't had a chance to do yet. The thing that surprised me is you're going over this glacier and it's rough, right? It's a river of ice, and you see all of these places where there are crevasses, and you see the places where it has stress fractures because it's turning a corner and the ice piles up and things like that. But when you're at the top, it's also covered with a layer of snow, and I thought it would be a rougher landing. I really had this picture of we're not landing on a runway, and not thinking, of course, that we're landing on several feet of snow on skis on a plane. And it was the smoothest, softest landing that I've ever had, because we're landing on snow. And of course, you get out and you're sinking into the snow and trying to keep the plane from doing the same. And I would say that having landed on a glacier was an amazingly cool thing. In terms of the sightseeing and the views, probably the flight seeing was more interesting. So I'll give you that, just so you know, Stephen, that you won't get any prettier by landing on the glacier. It's just pretty cool that you can.
Yeah.
Even more cool when you can take off again. That's the thing that you're very grateful for. It takes a little bit of runway and a little bit of airplane power on these very powerful engines on these small planes. But that is by far the highlight. And basically, when I got invited up to the Yukon and they said, and one of the things you're going to do is, I said yes. Absolutely. Not an inexpensive trip. I think, what is it, almost $200 a person?
In U.S., it'd be around 200. Yeah, it's about three and a quarter in Canadian, and the exchange rate would put you in around the 200 mark in U.S. dollars.
But I would say worth it, definitely, if you can do that, if the weather cooperates, because obviously they can only do that in certain weather. That is absolutely something I would recommend.
Exactly. Flight seeing is always sort of spectacular, whatever you're flying over, whether it's mountains or glacial scenery. But the novelty of being able to actually land on the glacier and then be within sight of Canada's tallest peak, Mount Logan, and the second tallest peak in North America, second only to Denali over in Alaska, which is only a few hundred miles away at that point. That's very unusual. I think we were talking with the pilots there and figuring out that there's sort of less than